The afternoon sun was shining gently across the busy city streets. Cars moved in steady lines, people walked quickly on the sidewalks, and the sound of horns mixed with the hum of daily life. Among the drivers on the road was a woman with calm eyes and a steady focus on where she was heading. She was dressed simply, nothing that would attract attention, and she drove carefully, following every rule as she had always done. To anyone passing by, she seemed like just another person going about her day. What no one knew at that moment was that she carried a new responsibility, one that would soon change how people looked at her. As she drove through the neighborhood, a police car appeared behind her. Its lights began to flash, painting the street with red and blue reflections. The sound of the siren was not loud, just enough to get her attention. She looked in her rearview mirror and realized she was being asked to pull over. Without hesitation, she guided her car to the side of the road, signaling properly, just as every careful driver would. Her movements were calm and practiced. She knew how to respond in such moments. The patrol car stopped behind her, and two officers stepped out. They walked toward her vehicle with the usual caution that officers carry when approaching any car. Their faces were serious, their eyes sharp, and their hands rested close to their belts. They had no idea who was sitting inside the car they had just stopped. For them, it was simply part of their duty checking drivers, ensuring safety, following procedure. The woman lowered her window and waited. Her expression was gentle, but there was a firmness in her posture. She had seen moments like this before, not as a driver but from another side of the law. Yet today she chose to remain quiet, letting the officers lead the interaction as they were trained to do. "Good afternoon, ma'am," one of the officers said politely, though his tone carried a hint of authority. "Do you know why we stopped you today?" She looked at him with calm eyes and replied softly, "No, officer, I don't." The officer nodded and explained that they had noticed a small detail with her vehicle that caught their attention. It was nothing major, just a routine check. Still, the procedure was clear: ask for identification, confirm details, and make sure everything was in order. "May I see your license and registration, please?" the second officer asked. The woman reached for her purse, moving slowly and carefully. She had lived long enough to understand the importance of every gesture in such situations. With steady hands, she handed over her driver's license and vehicle papers. There was no tension in her actions, no anger, no impatience, only a quiet dignity that seemed to fill the air around her. The officers took the documents and stepped back toward their car to run the information. She sat quietly, her eyes watching the movement of people around her on the street. Inside, she felt a small sense of irony. Life had brought her to this moment, where she was being stopped by the very officers who would soon look to her for guidance. She wondered if they had any idea of the surprise waiting for them. In the patrol car, the officers typed her details into the system. At first, everything seemed ordinary. Then, one of them paused, staring at the screen. A name appeared, along with a new designation that had recently been announced in the department. He blinked, read it again, and felt his breath catch slightly. He turned to his partner, who leaned closer to look at the information. Both exchanged quick, wide-eyed glances. The woman they had just stopped was not an ordinary citizen. She was their newly appointed chief of police. For a moment, silence filled the patrol car. The weight of the discovery pressed down on them. They thought about how they had approached her, the tone of their voices, the seriousness of their manner. They realized they had spoken to her as though she were any driver, without the slightest idea of her position. The truth hit them all at once: the person sitting calmly in that car was their new leader. Meanwhile, the woman sat waiting patiently, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. She was not nervous, not worried. She understood that the officers were only doing their jobs. A part of her even admired their professionalism, though she also noticed the cautious tone in their approach. She wondered how they would react once they returned and revealed what they now knew. The officers stepped out of the patrol car and walked back toward her, but this time their pace was different. Their movements carried a mix of hesitation and respect. One of them cleared his throat as he leaned slightly forward to hand back her license. "Ma'am," he began, his voice softer than before, "thank you for your cooperation. Everything is in order." Then he paused, searching for the right words. "And, congratulations on your new position." A faint smile touched her lips. She looked at them kindly, her eyes reflecting both understanding and quiet strength. "Thank you, officers," she said. Her voice carried warmth, not authority. She did not try to embarrass them, nor did she use her position to claim power. Instead, she allowed the moment to be one of humility and connection. The officers nodded, clearly aware of the unexpected situation they had just experienced. In their hearts, they felt both relief and a deep sense of respect. They had met their new chief not in a formal meeting or a grand introduction, but on the side of the road during a simple traffic stop. As she drove away, the woman thought about how symbolic the moment had been. Her first interaction with her officers had happened in the most ordinary of circumstances. It reminded her of the importance of humility and respect in leadership. It also reminded the officers that behind every driver, behind every stop, there was a human story. For the rest of that day, the two officers carried the experience with them. They knew the story would be remembered, not because it was dramatic, but because it revealed something powerful. Leadership is not about titles or uniforms, but about the way one carries oneself in every situation. And for the woman, it was only the beginning of her journey as chief. The woman drove away from the stop with her usual calm, but the two officers stood near their patrol car for a long moment before getting back inside. They could hardly believe what had just happened. The name on the license they had checked was the same name they had been hearing in meetings, the name that had been on the official notice pinned to the station board a few days earlier. Their department had just welcomed a new chief of police, and she was the woman they had unknowingly pulled over. As the patrol car merged back into traffic, the officers exchanged uneasy glances. The younger one shook his head and laughed nervously. "Can you believe that?" he muttered. The older officer sighed, his voice quieter, almost thoughtful. "That was our chief. Our new chief. And we stopped her on her first week in the city." They both went silent again, realizing how unusual the moment had been. In all their years of service, they had never experienced anything like this. To them, chiefs were figures of authority introduced formally, often behind podiums or at department briefings, not drivers waiting patiently on the side of the road. Back at the station, the story spread quickly. At first, it was shared in whispers, passed from one officer to another. "Did you hear? The new chief was stopped today." "Really? Who did it?" "The traffic unit. They didn't even know it was her." Soon, the tale reached nearly every corner of the building. By the time the chief herself walked through the doors later that afternoon, she was greeted not only with respect but with curiosity. Everyone wanted to know how she had reacted. What surprised them most was her attitude. She did not walk in angry, nor did she call the officers out for embarrassing her. Instead, she carried herself with quiet dignity. She greeted her staff warmly, shook hands, and thanked them for their service. When someone cautiously mentioned the morning's traffic stop, she simply smiled and replied, "They were doing their job. That is exactly what I expect from my officers." That simple statement changed the way people looked at her. Many chiefs in the past had entered with strong speeches about discipline, numbers, and results. She entered with a story that reminded everyone of fairness and humility. By showing that she respected the officer's duty even when it involved her, she had already set a powerful example of leadership. Later that week, she officially stood before her department for the first time. The officers gathered in the large hall, their uniforms neat, their expressions a mix of expectation and caution. For many, this was the first time seeing her in her full role as chief. She stepped up to the podium, her presence calm yet commanding. "I know many of you have already heard about our first meeting," she began, her voice clear but gentle. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. She smiled, acknowledging the shared memory. "Yes, it is true. I was stopped by two of our very own officers on the street. They didn't know who I was at the time, and that was perfectly fine. They followed procedure. They were professional. They did their duty." The hall was silent as everyone listened. Some shifted in their seats, curious about what she would say next. "What mattered to me," she continued, "was not that I was stopped, but how I was treated. I was treated with respect. I was asked politely for my documents. The process was handled with care. And that tells me something important: our officers can treat every person the same way, regardless of who they are." Her words carried weight. The story of the stop, which had begun as an awkward surprise, was now being used as a lesson for the whole department. She reminded them that leadership was not about rank alone. It was about setting an example in every encounter, even small ones. In the audience, the two officers who had made the stop sat quietly. Their faces burned with embarrassment at first, but as she spoke, they realized she was not criticizing them. Instead, she was honoring them. They had treated her as they would treat anyone else, and in doing so, they had unknowingly given her the perfect story to open her leadership with. After the meeting ended, officers approached her one by one, shaking her hand and expressing their respect. Some admitted they had doubted how she would lead, given the challenges the department faced. But seeing her use a personal experience to highlight fairness gave them a new sense of confidence in her. Outside the station, news of the incident had also begun to spread. A few community members had witnessed the stop, and once they learned who the woman was, the story reached local reporters. Soon, it appeared in small articles: "New police chief's first encounter with officers happens during traffic stop." The tone of the reports was light, even positive, painting her as someone who did not place herself above the law. She noticed how the public responded differently to the story compared to other news about the police. Instead of criticism, there was curiosity, even pride. People said things like, "At least she knows what it feels like to be treated like a citizen," and, "That's a good sign. Maybe she understands us better than the last chiefs did." The incident, simple as it was, created a sense of connection between her and the community. Privately, though, she reflected on the deeper meaning of the event. She knew her position carried challenges, especially as a black woman leading a department where most of the leadership had always looked very different from her. The stop reminded her that appearances could sometimes shape how people were treated. But it also gave her hope, because the officers had handled it correctly, showing that fairness was possible. That evening, as she sat in her office, she thought back to the moment when the officer leaned forward and quietly said, "Congratulations on your new position." She remembered the mix of surprise and respect in his eyes. It was a reminder that leadership is built not in titles alone, but in how people respond to you when they discover who you are. From that day on, she carried the story with her, not as a tale of embarrassment, but as a symbol of her start. Whenever she faced doubt or resistance, she remembered that her very first interaction with her officers had been an honest, unplanned test, and both sides had passed. The days following her first meeting with the department were filled with both excitement and quiet challenges. The new chief entered her office each morning with determination, knowing that every decision she made would be watched carefully, not only by her officers but also by the community. For years, people had spoken about needing change in the department. Now, eyes were on her to see if she could bring that change. She began by walking through the different divisions, introducing herself not from behind a desk but out in the field. Officers were surprised when she appeared during their shifts, asking questions, listening to their concerns, and observing their work. She rode along in patrol cars, stood near dispatchers answering calls, and even spent time in the training rooms where recruits were practicing drills. Her presence was not loud or demanding, it was steady, reminding everyone that she wanted to understand their world before asking them to understand her vision. But the road was not easy. Some officers doubted her leadership quietly, questioning whether she could handle the weight of the role. A few whispered about her background, pointing out that she was an outsider to their department, someone who had built her career elsewhere before being chosen as chief. Others, however, admired her calmness and the respect she had shown from the very first encounter. These mixed feelings created an atmosphere of caution, neither open resistance nor full acceptance, but a space where trust had to be earned. The chief knew this, and she accepted it. Trust was never handed freely in law enforcement, it was built through consistency. She reminded herself of this truth every morning when she looked at her reflection in the mirror before heading to work. She knew her journey would not be about quick victories but about slow, steady steps that proved she belonged. One afternoon, she called for a meeting with her command staff. The senior officers entered the conference room, their expressions polite but guarded. Some sat upright with folded arms, while others leaned back in their chairs, waiting to hear what direction she would set. She began not with a lecture, but with a question. "What do you think our biggest challenge is right now?" she asked, her voice calm and open. The room was quiet for a moment before one officer spoke. "Community trust," he said. "People don't see us the way they used to. There's distance between us and them." Another added, "Morale among our own officers. Many feel the workload is heavy, and they're not always sure leadership is standing with them." She nodded at both points, listening carefully. Then she leaned forward, her hands resting gently on the table. "If we want to build trust outside these walls, we have to first build trust inside them. That means I need to earn your trust, and you need to know that I am here with you. I don't expect it to happen overnight. But I do expect us to move forward together." The honesty in her words struck a chord. She did not pretend to have all the answers. Instead, she made it clear that her strength would come from listening and learning as much as from leading. From that meeting forward, she set out to prove her commitment through action. She worked late nights reviewing cases, studying patterns in community complaints, and walking into neighborhoods where residents often felt forgotten. On several evenings, she attended local gatherings without any formal announcement, quietly sitting among community members and hearing their stories. At first, people were cautious. But when they realized she was genuinely listening, their voices grew louder. They spoke about safety, fairness, and the need to feel respected. Her presence in these spaces did not go unnoticed by the officers either. Word spread quickly, the chief was not only speaking about building trust, she was out there doing it. Slowly, the whispers of doubt began to soften, replaced by curiosity about what she might accomplish. Of course, the journey was not without resistance. Some days, frustration filled the air. An officer would challenge a new idea, or a community member would question whether real change could happen. The chief felt the weight of those doubts pressing on her shoulders. But each time, she returned to the memory of her very first interaction with her officers on the side of the road. That moment reminded her that respect is strongest when it is mutual. She carried that lesson forward, answering frustration with patience and anger with calm. Her greatest effort, however, was not only to lead with words but also with example. When an emergency struck, she was among the first to arrive, standing side by side with officers in difficult situations. When a young recruit struggled during training, she offered encouragement, reminding them that mistakes were part of growth. When an older officer felt overlooked, she made time to listen, reminding them that their years of service still mattered deeply. Every step of her journey required patience and resilience. Some evenings, after long days of work, she returned home and sat in silence, reflecting on the challenges she faced. She thought about the expectations of the community, the doubts of her officers, and the pressure of being both the first woman and the first black leader in her role. The weight was heavy, but she refused to let it break her spirit. Instead, she saw it as proof that she was walking a path worth taking. Her story spread beyond the department as well. Local newspapers began to follow her work more closely, highlighting her efforts to connect with the community and rebuild trust. Some headlines praised her, calling her a leader with grace. Others questioned whether her methods would truly bring change. But no matter what the papers said, she stayed focused on her mission. What kept her steady was not the praise or the criticism, but the belief that leadership is shown in everyday actions. Each handshake, each conversation, each long night at her desk was part of the effort to build something greater than herself. She knew the journey would not be measured in weeks or months, but in years. The two officers who had first stopped her during that traffic check noticed the difference too. When they saw her in the station now, they greeted her not with nervous smiles but with genuine respect. They remembered how calm she had been that day on the road, and now they saw the same calm guiding her leadership. For them, and for many others, that simple beginning had grown into a symbol of who she truly was. In time, the department began to shift, slowly but surely. Meetings were no longer filled with silence but with open discussions. Officers began suggesting new ideas, knowing their voices would be heard. Community members began to attend events where once they had stayed away. And at the center of it all was a chief who believed that every effort, no matter how small, could lead to change. Her journey was far from finished, but one truth was already clear: she had earned the respect not by demanding it, but by working for it every single day. Weeks turned into months, and slowly the department began to feel different. The new chief's presence was not just seen in meetings or on paper, it was felt in the way officers carried themselves and in the way the community began to respond. At first, the changes were small: an extra smile during patrols, a few more community members willing to talk to officers at local events, but soon those small changes began to add up to something larger. The chief's focus was on building bridges, and though the work was hard, there were moments when she could see the results shining through. One of those moments happened during a tense community gathering in the town hall. A heated debate had broken out between residents and officers over a recent incident in the neighborhood. Voices were raised, emotions ran high, and it seemed like the meeting might collapse into chaos. The chief stepped forward, raising her hand not with force, but with calm. Her voice was steady, carrying both firmness and care. "I hear you," she said to the community members. "I hear your anger, and I understand your pain. But I ask you to also hear me. We are not here to fight one another, we are here to find a way forward together." Her words settled into the room. The shouting softened into murmurs, and slowly people began to listen. She shared her own experience of being treated as an ordinary citizen, reminding them that she too had once sat in their place, uncertain and cautious. Then she turned to the officers in the room and reminded them of their responsibility to treat every voice with respect, no matter how loud or critical it might be. By the end of that evening, the mood had shifted. The anger was still there. Real change takes time, but the community left with a sense of hope. They had seen a chief who did not hide behind titles or ranks but stood openly, willing to face hard questions. That night was remembered as one of the first breakthroughs, a turning point where trust began to rebuild on both sides. Inside the department, the breakthroughs came in quieter ways. One morning, a veteran officer knocked on the chief's door. He had served for more than 20 years and was known for being cautious about change. At first, many thought he would resist the new leadership. But on that morning, he stood in front of her desk and said simply, "Chief, I didn't know what to expect when you came in. But I see now that you stand with us. You've earned my respect." Those words meant more to her than any newspaper headline. They told her that progress was real, that the walls of doubt were beginning to crack. She smiled at the officer, thanked him for his honesty, and reminded him that respect was something they would continue to build together. The hardest challenges, however, were not always in meetings or conversations. They often came in the middle of emergencies. One afternoon, a call came in about a dangerous situation in one of the neighborhoods. Instead of staying behind her desk, the chief grabbed her jacket and joined the officers on the scene. The tension was high, and residents watched nervously as the police worked to calm things down. When the chief stepped out of the car, people recognized her immediately. Some were surprised to see her there, standing on the ground with her officers, rather than directing from afar. Her presence changed the atmosphere. She spoke calmly to both residents and officers, guiding the situation until it came under control. By the end of it, people were not only relieved that the crisis had passed, but also impressed that their chief had stood with them in the middle of it. Later, one officer whispered to another, "She's not just talking about leadership. She's showing it." These moments, big and small, began to shape her reputation. The story of the traffic stop that had once been an amusing tale inside the department was now joined by other stories of her standing firm in tough meetings, of her listening to families, of her walking alongside officers during long nights. Each story added to the picture of who she was, a leader who believed in fairness, respect, and courage. The media began to notice as well. Articles that once questioned her ability now praised her commitment. Headlines spoke of a chief who walks with her officers and a new voice of trust in the community. Still, she paid little attention to praise. She knew that leadership was not about good headlines but about real change that lasted beyond words. In her private moments, she often reflected on how far things had come since that first day on the road when she had been pulled over. Back then, she was a stranger in the eyes of the officers. Now, she was their chief, and she felt their respect each time they stood beside her. She thought about the irony of it. Her leadership journey with them had begun with flashing lights in her rearview mirror, and now those same lights represented a force she guided with trust and purpose. There were still challenges ahead, there always would be. Not every officer agreed with her methods, and not every community member trusted the police completely. But she no longer saw those challenges as walls blocking her path. Instead, she saw them as steps on the climb. Each step was difficult, but each one brought her closer to the vision she held for her department. One evening, after a particularly long day, she sat at her desk with the window open. The city lights glowed softly outside, and the sounds of distant traffic filled the air. She thought about her journey, the effort it had taken, and the breakthroughs she had achieved. She knew that her story was still being written, but she also knew that something important had already happened. The officers were beginning to believe in her, and the community was beginning to trust again. That thought filled her with quiet strength. She leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes for a moment, and let out a slow breath. Leadership, she realized, was not about being perfect. It was about being present. It was about showing up, again and again, no matter how hard the road became. And as long as she continued to do that, the breakthroughs would keep coming. Time passed, and what had once been an uncertain beginning slowly turned into a story that people spoke about with pride. The chief had walked into her new role with calm strength, and now her department and community were starting to see the difference her leadership made. Her days were still long and filled with challenges, but there was also a sense of hope that had not been felt in a long time. The story of the traffic stop was still remembered, though by now it had grown into more than just a light-hearted tale. Officers repeated it to new recruits, often with a smile, as a reminder that you never know who you might be speaking to or how important fairness is in every encounter. The chief herself would sometimes mention it during speeches, not to embarrass anyone, but to show that her first meeting with her officers had taught her something valuable. "I was treated like anyone else," she would say, "and that is exactly how it should be for every citizen." That message became the heart of her leadership. She wanted both the department and the community to see that respect was not something handed out only to the powerful. Respect belonged to everyone, and it was the duty of the police to make sure it was given. Slowly, that idea began to shape the culture of the department. Officers who had once approached their duties with distance started to approach them with care. Younger recruits looked at the chief as a role model, someone who showed them that strength could come from kindness just as much as from authority. Beyond the department walls, her story began to inspire others as well. Local schools invited her to speak to students, asking her to share how she had reached her position. She spoke about hard work, about believing in yourself even when others doubted you, and about the importance of never forgetting your values. Young people listened with wide eyes, especially those who had grown up thinking that leadership positions were out of reach for them. Seeing someone who looked like them, who spoke to them honestly, gave them a new vision of what was possible. At community gatherings, residents often shared how different things felt. "I see more officers walking in our neighborhoods now," one mother said during a meeting. "And when I stop to talk to them, they listen. That didn't happen before." An elderly man added, "It feels like the wall between us and the department is finally starting to come down." These small comments meant the world to the chief. They were proof that the effort, the patience, and the sleepless nights were beginning to bear fruit. The officers noticed it too. They began to see that when the community trusted them more, their own work became easier and safer. They no longer felt like outsiders in the neighborhoods they patrolled. Instead, they felt like partners. The chief often reminded them, every handshake, every conversation, every act of fairness builds a bridge. And when enough bridges are built, trust grows stronger. Her leadership style also began to change the way other departments looked at their own practices. Word of her approach spread beyond the city, and invitations arrived for her to speak at conferences and share her story. At first, she was surprised by the attention, but she accepted, not for her own recognition, but because she believed the lessons she had learned could help others. In her speeches, she often returned to the moment that started it all. She described being stopped on the side of the road, the flashing lights in her mirror, the officers approaching her window without realizing who she was. She explained how that moment shaped her understanding of fairness and reminded her that everyone deserves the same respect, no matter their title or position. Listeners leaned in as she spoke, many nodding, some even smiling at the simplicity of the story. What began as an ordinary traffic stop had grown into a symbol of change, a reminder that leadership begins in small moments. Back in her city, the chief remained humble. She continued to walk through the halls of her department, greeting officers by name, listening to their concerns, and sharing in their daily challenges. She continued to attend community meetings, sitting with families and hearing their voices. Even when her schedule was full, she made time for these moments because she knew they were the foundation of everything she wanted to build. There were still difficulties, of course. Not every day was filled with success, and not every challenge had an easy answer. Some situations tested her patience, and some setbacks made progress feel slow. But she had learned to see those struggles as part of the journey. Change, she often reminded her officers, was not a destination but a process. "We are walking together," she would say. "And as long as we keep walking, we are moving forward." The community began to see her not just as a chief of police but as a symbol of what could happen when respect and humility guided leadership. Children pointed to her as an example of someone who broke barriers. Families spoke of her as someone who understood them. Officers saw her as a leader who stood with them, not above them. Her journey became a story told in many voices, the story of a woman who was once stopped on the street like anyone else, only to be revealed as the leader of those very officers. But the true story was not about the surprise of that moment. It was about what she did after, how she used it as a lesson, how she turned it into inspiration, and how she carried it forward into every decision she made. On a quiet evening, months after her appointment, she walked out of the station and paused to look at the city lights glowing in the distance. She thought about where she had started, about the doubts she had faced, and about the breakthroughs that had come with time. She knew the road ahead would still be long, but she felt peace in knowing that she was walking it with honesty and purpose. She smiled softly as she remembered that first stop. What had once been an unexpected moment on the side of the road had become the beginning of something far greater, a story of trust, respect, and change. It reminded her, and everyone else, that leadership is not about where you sit, but about how you stand, especially when no one knows your title. And so, her legacy was not just written in reports or meetings, but in the hearts of the people she served. For the officers, she became the chief who earned their respect by standing beside them. For the community, she became the leader who listened when others did not. And for those watching from afar, she became proof that humility, fairness, and courage could truly transform a department. Her story continued, not as an ending, but as a symbol, one that would inspire others long after the flashing lights of that first traffic stop had faded away.